Well, Barb, Joe, Dave, thank you so much for the very gracious welcome here. It is a real treat to be back here at a place that I'm always honored and humbled to be, at the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council. Thank you so much for having me. I want to take the 50% of your Chinese vocabulary and build on it with one syllable and give you the Texas rendition, and that is ni howdy. And I want to just say for the record, since we're on the record, ni howdy y'all is also acceptable. That is true. I just want to say, since we're on the record, that is not my coinage. I acknowledge that. That is, someone taught me that last summer, and it was one of the moments of revelation in my life, because being from the great state of Texas and studying China, oddly enough, that formulation had never occurred to me until last summer. But ni hao to y'all. It's great to be here. Listen, I am delighted to be here, and I'm so humbled by the turnout, and I know from the turnout that my reputation has not preceded me, and I'm delighted about that. But the topic matter really is very timely, very topical, very important, and it's a privilege to be here with you to talk about it. Let me map out what I'd like to do tonight. I want to say a few words about the University of Texas China Public Policy Center, which Dave kindly mentioned earlier. And just very briefly, since it is a brand new organization and probably is the newest China-focused nonprofit in the United States. But then, most importantly, I want to delve into the 19th Party Congress, talk a little bit about the background of it and the context, and then spend some time on what I regard, and many would agree, are some of the key takeaways from the 19th Party Congress. And then I want to share a few of my own kind of analytical observations about that. And after that, I then want to just touch briefly on another topic that was mentioned that would be of interest and that builds on the 19th Party Congress, and that is, what are the implications of the 19th Party Congress for U.S.-China relations? So I'll say a little bit about that. When I finish and we break for breakfast, we will then go into, the second part of the session. But I will try to keep it shorter than I sometimes do, because I know from experience from when I was here in 2012, the questions that you have are terrific, and I really look forward to that interaction as well. So first, let me just say a brief word about the new University of Texas China Public Policy Center at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I was humbled to have the opportunity to be the founding executive director of this center. We started last August. The motto of the University of Texas is, "What starts here changes the world." And the China Public Policy Center is designed to give the University of Texas at Austin a platform to really engage very substantively with China on policy topics in a way that we haven't been able to do sort of fully in the past. And so this creates an opportunity for the university to really engage in ways that are new, that are fresh, and that hopefully can generate innovative contributions to the discourse around China-related policy subject matters. Our basic mandate is to advance China-related public policy study, to advance innovative ideas in this area, and to do so in ways that leverage the comparative advantages and unique strengths of the University of Texas, the LBJ School for that matter, also the City of Austin, the state of Texas, to try to put, as we would call it, a burnt orange imprint on our China policy agenda. And I think it's a tremendously exciting thing to be a part of, and I'm really humbled to be able to do it. I also want to express great gratitude to University of Texas President Greg Fenves, whose visionary leadership made this possible, and to my good friend, the Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Angela Evans, without whom also the center wouldn't be here. Now, let me say, before I get into the subject matter, just one other point that I want to make, and that is some words that I am not accustomed to saying at the outset of a talk in the Denver area. So this is unfamiliar territory to me, and that is the following words. Well, there's always next season. So this is not, I'm telling you, these are not words that I'm used to uttering here in this great city, in this great state, but listen, there is hope. with that, let me talk about the subject matter. 19th Party Congress. Let me just put that in a little bit of context. So in China, you have a system in which you have a state and a party. The party is at the top of the heap. The Communist Party of China, runs the People's Republic of China. It runs the government, and the government runs the country. And so the Party Congress is distinct from the National People's Congress, or China's national legislature. It is a Congress or a convening of the Communist Party as a political party. And it happens once every 5 years. This last year, 2017, was the most recent one. Dave alluded to it. And in October of 2017, we had what was called the 19th Party Congress, the 19th convening of the Communist Party formally as a party. And every 5 years, you have one of these convenings, and it tends to fall into one of two broad categories. Either it's a convening that takes place at the outset of a new administration, if you will, with new leaders coming in, new faces, a new leader of China, a new deputy leader of China, or, if you will, to borrow a term from U.S. politics, it is a midterm type of party congress that's taking place 5 years into the leadership term of one of China's sets of leaders. The one we just had in 2017, the one that China had and that the world witnessed, is in the second category. It's a kind of midterm 5-year convening. So Xi Jinping was General Secretary and Chairman of the Central Military Commission and, parenthetically, President of the country, and also were wearing a number of other hats in terms of leadership. And in the October 2017 party convening, or 19th Party Congress, he was, if you will, re-elected, reselected, chosen once again by his peers, quite unanimously to continue to serve in those positions. His deputy, the Premier of China, was also granted a second 5-year term, and then 5 new faces came into the Politburo Standing Committee, and the Politburo, and then the various committees, the Central Committee and the other structures of the Communist Party. Let me just mention a few key takeaways from the Party Congress, having laid out the basic backdrop. So this was an important political convening, comes at the middle point of the Xi Jinping administration of China. And here are some of the things that I think stand out. First of all, just in terms of Xi Jinping's role, a couple of points to make. Number one, it's very clear that Xi Jinping, who already was very powerful as a leader of China, owing to his numerous leadership capacities and hats, is now even more powerful as leader of China than he was before October of 2017, for a variety of reasons. Some examples or illustrations of that are the fact that Xi Jinping thought, the body of thought attributed to Xi Jinping, has now entered the Chinese Communist Party's constitution. The party's constitution, not the national constitution. Again, there's a distinction between party and state. And so Xi Jinping thought has entered, if you will, the pantheon of political thought in China, right alongside what's called Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping theory. These are very specific and specialized terms in the Chinese political context, and now it can be said formally and with justification that Xi Jinping is now officially and theoretically and in practice arguably the most powerful single Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping, or maybe since Mao Zedong. So he came out of the Congress with considerable power. On a related note, the Politburo Standing Committee, which has 7 members, all men, at this time, and historically that's been true. The Politburo Standing Committee has 7 members, Xi Jinping, the Premier, and 5 others. And the general consensus is that most of those individuals had ties to Xi Jinping or worked very closely with him in some cases over the years, which is another way of saying that basically Xi Jinping has 6 more or less allies, strong allies, and loyal political allies in the 7-member, the all-important 7-member Politburo Standing Committee. So he's consolidated power in that regard. An interesting side note is there is no, at this time, there is no particular heir apparent evident in the membership of the Politburo Standing Committee. So to put it in historical perspective, in 2007, 10 years ago or so, Xi Jinping became the heir apparent at, if you will, the midterm party Congress 10 years before, 2007, and that signaled and telegraphed that he would become the next leader of China in 2012, and he did. This time around, we don't see a figure that is the analog to Xi Jinping in 2007. So it's an interesting and perhaps somewhat uncharted place to be, politically speaking, in China. And what it means is there's less clarity and predictability and perhaps transparency than there has historically been in this type of a party Congress convening, and in the results of the convening and in the newly constituted Politburo Standing Committee. So all of that points to an enhanced status relative to an already strong presidency and general secretaryship, etc., that Xi Jinping had to begin with. So I think that's one very important takeaway. With respect to the party itself, I think there were three statements that Xi Jinping made in his capacity as general secretary to the assembled group of party leadership in October. It was kind of the main keynote, serious, heavy-duty, literally 3.5 hour speech where Xi Jinping laid out the vision for the party. And in that speech, obviously, many things were there. The ones I want to point to in terms of where the sort of thinking and writing and discussion of the party are as follows. Number one, Xi Jinping said that, he himself said that the party, the Chinese Communist Party, is the defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. The defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics. He also said that the Chinese Communist Party leadership is the, quote, greatest strength of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And finally, that the party is the highest force for political leadership in China. So it was an articulation in some ways of the obvious, but it was an articulation that, in a sense, at a theoretical and doctrinal level, formally said what has always been understood, which is that the party is the power in China, period. And it gives expression, in a sense, a fuller kind of doctrinal level expression to that notion of the monopoly on power of the Communist Party of China. Now, in this regard, I think it's important to note that what we see is a greater level of codifying something that I think has always been understood. And that is that I would say that what the term I use is the first principle of Chinese governance and the first principle of Chinese policy is, in fact, the maintenance of Communist Party rule. And in fact, that is suggested in the Constitution of the People's Republic of China in Article 1 in particular, and to a certain degree in the preamble to the Constitution. Now, that first principle, as I have called it in the past, is codified, in a sense, in authoritative party documentation. So that's a significant shift relative to what we've seen in the past, although it definitely maintains the same trend line. Let me say a few words about the economy and what was said about the economy and what came out of the 19th Party Congress with respect to the economy. First of all, I think it's fair to say that there were not any screaming headlines, I think, as I saw it, on economic matters. What we basically saw coming out of the Party Congress was a commitment to the basic contours of Chinese policy as it has been practiced in recent years, both under Xi Jinping and in previous administrations. And it's a commitment to continue opening and reform, to continue engaging with the world, to continue and enhance trade with the world, to, as Xi Jinping said, open our doors even wider to that trade, but nevertheless to continue to have a very strong state sector and state involvement in the economy. So to put it in perspective, the majority of the Chinese economy today is responsive to the market mechanism. The majority of GDP is produced owing to the market mechanism. But a very, very substantial minority, probably 40+% of the Chinese economy, is state-owned enterprises and state-run economic entities. So it has turned the corner, but it is still very much a hybrid economy in which the state continues to play a very significant role. I don't think anyone sees that changing significantly anytime soon. In that regard, that's why I say that I don't think there was a very significant policy departure articulated out of the Party Congress about the economy. Xi Jinping did make clear that he welcomes continued trade, again wants to open the doors, but the proof will be in the pudding down the line. I think the U.S. business community in recent years has come, for its part, has come to be very skeptical of promises. Sometimes words are said, promises are made, commitments are made, but in the end, the actual end result is not quite as desirable as the pledge was theoretically. And in fact, U.S. business representatives in China have noted in recent years that if anything, the business climate in China, at least from a U.S. business standpoint, has deteriorated owing to greater restrictiveness on certain market access issues, greater regulatory pressures, and non-regulatory and political pressures that have sometimes been brought to bear in ways that are frustrating and problematic for U.S. and other foreign companies. So the theory is to open the doors wider, to engage more. Over time, we will see the degree to which the reality matches the theory. Let me say a little bit about the topic of anti-corruption, which has been a very important theme in Chinese politics since the rise of Xi Jinping in 2012. Xi Jinping has said, and he said again during this Party Congress in October of 2017, that the greatest threat to the Communist Party is corruption. The greatest threat to the Communist Party is its own internal corruption. That's what Xi Jinping himself has said publicly. In my recollection, I think he has been more forward-leaning in making that type of statement than his predecessors ever were. Other Chinese leaders have certainly noted that there has been corruption, which there certainly has been, quite rampantly within the Chinese Communist Party. But I think that Xi Jinping is really the first leader to say this is an existential threat to our party's ability to maintain its permanent monopoly on power. And thus, he has made a commitment publicly and in terms of his actions and his administration's actions to go after corruption within the party as a party matter, not a federal matter, not a national government matter, as a party matter, and to do his utmost and the party's utmost to root out corruption. Now, in recent years, quite a large number of significant Chinese leaders at some of the very top levels have been taken down on corruption charges, have been prosecuted. In some cases, there have one individual died before being prosecuted. In another more recent case, a senior general who had been a member of what we might call the Chinese Joint Chiefs of Staff, what the Chinese would call their Central Military Commission, committed suicide while under investigation for corruption. And there have been a not inconsequential number of very significant figures who have been forced out of office and in most cases prosecuted quite severely for corruption. Now, in coming out of the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping has pledged to continue that effort. The words that he has used to describe the effort are that the anti-corruption effort is going to be a, quote, crushing tide against those who are corrupt, those within the party who are corrupt, and that the party, as he put it, has, quote, zero tolerance for corruption. Now, let's also point out the obvious fact. Dealing with corruption, and I've said this to my Chinese counterparts and friends, and I think it's understood. Dealing with corruption and trying to root out corruption in the context of a one-party state is, and I don't mean it facetiously, it's a losing proposition. It's a losing proposition because you don't have the checks and balances and independent sources of power necessary to get to the root of the problem. You also don't have that wonderful thing we call the fourth estate, a free and independent and vigorous media to challenge the government as it sees fit, to challenge narratives, to expose wrongdoing and so on. And absent checks and balances within the governance structure and absent free media, you're never going to get to the root of most of the corruption. That's the point that I've said publicly and privately, including to some of my Chinese friends. That said, what I think is clear to me, and I think scholars and analysts may disagree to varying degrees on this, to put it in sort of numeric terms, I think that absent checks and balances in a free media, you can probably solve about 5% of the corruption problem. And semicolon, the second part of the sentence is, I think Xi Jinping is very committed to solving that 5% of the problem, in fairness to the Chinese leadership. Now, what the Chinese leadership's motivations are is a subject of debate. Is it genuine concern about corruption and good governance and clean government? Is it settling political scores? There's a robust debate about that. But I think it's very clear from the last 5 years of actions, not just words, that China itself, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, led by Xi Jinping himself, do in fact attach enormous importance to this and are doing things that have never been done before. That continues coming out of the 19th Party Congress. Let me talk a little bit about foreign policy and military doctrine, and then share a few analytical observations and turn finally to U.S.-China relations. On foreign and military policy, let me just say a couple of things. One, if you look at the 66 pages, it was 66 pages of the official English version of Xi Jinping's significant speech at the Party Congress, you could do a word search, and there's actually very little real substantive reference to foreign policy in the document. It's almost surprising, I would say. Certainly a lot of references to the economy, social situation, social policy, obviously the party building itself, anti-corruption, quite a bit about the military, which I'll talk about. Relatively little actually on foreign policy. So again, under the rubric of foreign policy, I would characterize the 19th Party Congress as not generating what I would call a screaming headline. But what it did say was basically China is going to continue under the leadership of the party its more or less its current foreign policy course, what it refers to as an independent foreign policy of peace. That's a set phrase, an independent foreign policy of peace, and to obviously advance China's interests as China sees its interests. So in its broad contours, there wasn't anything that leapt out of the document, the speech, the Party Congress as a whole, that said China's going in a new direction. But tonally, there were a couple of points of departure from previous tonality and previous language that we saw in these types of party events. So let me just say a couple of things about that and talk a little about the military as well. I think the 3 points that I would make with respect to foreign policy that tonally or thematically came out of the Party Congress were, number one, that China is now clearly a more self-confident player in the world, in its language, in its tone, in the kind of things that it's saying, in the style in which it's communicating. In all of those ways, I think China is a more confident player in the world, a more confident nation among nations. That, I think, is very clear, and it comes through the language that we saw coming out of the Congress. The second point that I would make, and I think this is quite significant, is that in my analysis, really for the first time explicitly, China has come out and said in the wake, during the Party Congress and in the wake of the Party Congress, in a sense, and these are my words summarizing, in a sense, we now put ourselves into the global marketplace of ideas as an alternative governance model to the United States and to the West. Now, that was always implicit, but the fact that China would essentially come out and rather explicitly say, we see ourselves as a viable alternative model or template for those societies who wish to govern and develop and prosper, but who don't necessarily wish to do so along the model of along the lines of the model of the United States of America or Western Europe. So they're billing themselves as a viable alternative model that can be, and presumably or implicitly perhaps should be, studied and adopted as countries see fit. That type of statement is a departure, in my judgment, from previous rhetoric around this issue. China's previous rhetoric had basically been, we do things our way. You do your thing, I'll do mine. You don't interfere in my internal affairs, I won't interfere in your internal affairs. We have our system rooted in our national conditions, you have your system rooted in yours. And all of that was fine and good. And now what we see is the next phase of that, which is our system works for us and maybe it can work for you too. That's different. That's different. That's quite consequential. If I were saying what are the 5 things out of the 66 pages or out of the whole Congress that caught my eye, that was one of them. The third thing I would say about China's foreign policy is that it's clearly focused on what is now referred to and has been for a few years now as the Chinese or China dream. And this is a Xi Jinping rhetorical device and concept, and I would argue one of the more eloquent ones that we have seen from a Chinese leader. The Chinese leadership sometimes produces slogans like scientific outlook on development, which is a little bit less inspiring than the China dream, or the 3 represents, the 4 comprehensives. So the Chinese dream, that's something people can understand and latch onto. And what it means is a reclamation of Chinese greatness, the rejuvenation, as the Chinese would say, of Chinese greatness, of the great Chinese nation. In a sense, a reclamation of the greatness that China had historically, lost along the way for various reasons, and now is out there in front of China ready to be reclaimed. That is a very significant construct in China today, and it's one that I think is actually moving and inspiring people in ways that previous political slogans didn't. And here, let me just make a basic point that relates to foreign policy, but it relates to China more broadly, and that is the notion of the social compact. I think there has been an important shift in the social compact, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but I want to flag here that it relates to the Chinese dream, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So those are the things about foreign policy that stood out. Let me say a little bit about the military doctrine that was articulated by Xi Jinping and that came out of the 19th Party Congress. Here again, I would say this was some of the more striking language from a U.S. perspective, and maybe from a Chinese perspective and from others as well. Because we actually, I think, heard things with formulations that we had not heard before, which I think are significant and which I think merit attention. So, first of all, I think very fundamentally, the notion of, let me explain one basic point about the military as a baseline for a couple of points to make about it. And that is that the military of China answers to the Communist Party of China. It does not answer to the leadership of the People's Republic of China in their capacities as leaders of the People's Republic of China. It answers to the party leadership in their capacities as party leaders. So the People's Liberation Army is quite literally the party's army. Quite literally the party's army. Now, that is doctrinally true. But what was also brought into the Chinese Constitution explicitly is the notion, and it's very clear, now very codified and clear-cut, of, as I think the phrase was, absolute control by the Communist Party of China of the People's Liberation Army, the armed forces of China, and all armed police and other entities in China. So the notion of absolute party control, in the words of, again, the Chinese leadership, over the Chinese military, that was a theme that came out of this Congress. Now, that is consistent with past practice, but the language is more emphatic than what we've seen in the past. Secondly, and this is really, I think, the more striking language, Xi Jinping said the following in his speech. He said, "The military is built to fight and win wars." Full stop. That's a direct quote. The military is built to fight and win wars. Now, those words are very familiar to Americans because U.S. presidents of both parties have often said the mission of our military is to fight and win wars in various formulations. That's a common usage in our country. It is unusual to hear a Chinese leader speaking about the military with language that is, we've typically heard more often in the U.S. military context, fighting and winning wars. And President Xi went on to say that combat capability, that's his term, combat capability is the ultimate metric against which we judge the quality of our armed forces. And the point here is that we don't just judge the forces, these are my words, but kind of getting to the essence of it, on their uniforms or how many tanks we have or how straight people can march. We're going to judge as the ultimate metric the quality of our military on the basis of their ability to perform combat. Now that is a significant statement. Now every country has the right to raise its own military and raise its own armed forces and fight for itself as it sees fit. That's the right of any sovereign country. But to hear China speak about it in such language, there's nothing wrong with it, but it is different than what we have heard before. And it's striking. It struck my ear. It would be another of the 5 things that I'd pull away and say that was quite a remarkable turn of phrase. And now, let me make one other point with respect to the military, and that is I went through the speech of Xi Jinping, the sort of keynote major address of the 2017 Party Congress, and looked at every page. There was one sentence, and only one, that ended with an exclamation point. There was one. Every other one ended with a period. The only sentence that ended with an exclamation point was, and I'm paraphrasing very closely, "We will never let anyone take Taiwan away from us." And that is the only sentence in 66 pages that had an exclamation point in the Chinese official text of the speech. So, on the topic of the military, and by the way, that was reported to be the largest applause line in the entire 3.5-hour speech. So, a clear continued commitment on the part of the Chinese leadership to, as they would put it, reunify with Taiwan, or generate reunification between Taiwan and the mainland. So that's out there, and we can talk more about that in another context. Let me share a few analytical observations. Now, what I tried to do in the last several minutes is to kind of lay out what I see as some of the key takeaways, and I've tried to kind of be faithful to what was said so that you know what the Chinese said. Let me now offer my opinions about some of these things and kind of what I think it means and where it's going. And it mainly leads to one idea that I want to share here for the first time. I've talked about this privately, I've discussed it a little bit with some colleagues, over the years, but I haven't yet rolled it out. I want to sort of mention it here as a new idea to think about. And it's in the context of a broad analytical observation I want to make about the Party Congress. As we've seen, what I referred to as the first principle of Chinese governance or policy, which is the mandate, the mission of maintaining the permanent monopoly on power of the Communist Party, has been codified in the party doctrine. It's been spoken about explicitly. It is part of the party constitution now. It is very clear, and it's very straightforward. So what was always assumed and understood is now a matter of doctrinal record. So with that said, where I see, if you take all of the elements of the 19th Party Congress and kind of take a step back and look at what they point to at a big picture level. We talked about Xi Jinping and his role and his consolidation of personal power at the helm of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese leadership, talked about the economy, corruption, and so on. I think if we take a step back, the broad trend that I see in China is that, and I see it coming strongly out of the 19th Party Congress, and it's an even broader trend than that. I think China is very committed to perfecting its own self-defined constitutional regime type. In Article 1 of China's constitution, China refers to itself, its regime type, as a people's democratic dictatorship. So, and that's also true in English. That is the official English translation on the Chinese website. So that's their translation. So China refers to itself in Chinese and in English as a people's democratic dictatorship. The noun is dictatorship. That's the noun they chose for themselves. What I think China is trying to do is to perfect what I would call a smart dictatorship. Now, here I'm using the term dictatorship because that's the term that the Chinese use in their own constitution. So let's develop that. I think China wants to develop a smart people's democratic dictatorship and perfect a model in which you can generate minimal political participation and maximal economic output and benefit to the masses, if you will, maximally efficient economic and social performance without losing the reins of political control, and to sharpen the model, the techniques, the governance strategies, to create that viable alternative to the US/European/ most of the rest of the world model of democratic governance and market economics. China, I think, wants to perfect its own unique approach to governing in what I refer to in the Chinese context as a smart dictatorship. Now, let me just say a few words about what I mean by this, because there's a little clever gimmick to this as well. I took SMART and made it an acronym, SMART, and I think I came up with some words that I think get at what China is trying to do. The S stands for the social compact. S is for social compact. And I think that China's social compact, historically, has been the idea, basically, in the last 35 plus years, in the period of opening and reform. From a Chinese Communist Party leadership perspective, the language would be, you the people, or we the party, let's start, we the party will deliver stunning levels of economic growth to you, the people of this country. You, the people, will stay out of the political process. And that's the basic social contract or social compact that has obtained in China since reform and opening up. And I think most Chinese party leaders would say that they have held up their end of the bargain, if you accept that that is the contract that's on the table. That's the only one that was on the table. But if you accept that that's what the contract was, Chinese leaders would say, we held up our end. Many Chinese would say, the party did hold up its end. They held up their end. And meanwhile, the people are not involved in governance in China in the way that we are here and in many other democracies. So that contract or compact has held. What I think is happening now is that there's a transformation to a second or new social contract in China. And that is now that many, many Chinese are enormously wealthy, and a great swath are of what we might call moderate or middle income means. Not all. There's still big swaths of poverty in China and a lot of people in the countryside that aren't doing well. But on the whole, many, many hundreds of millions of people are doing better materially. And there are, I think, probably hundreds of millions that would call themselves middle class in the Chinese context. Now that that's been delivered, what I think the Chinese leadership is saying to the people is social contract 2.0, we will make you proud of your country like you've never been. We will make you proud of China as a nation among nations like you've never felt before. And in exchange, you continue to stay out of the political process. So, having delivered prosperity to many hundreds of millions of people, not all, but hundreds of millions, now the stakes are raised. It's that Chinese dream, China dream. It's that notion of national rejuvenation. And it's the notion of, if I can use this loaded term, make China great again. And that's what the Chinese leadership is promising to the people. So that's under social compact. The M, S-M-A-R-T, the M, what does that stand for? It stands for market-based, but with an asterisk. I think increasingly China will move probably gradually toward increasing levels of reliance on the market mechanism. When you think about it, most autocracies or dictatorships, and again, I'm using the term from the Chinese Constitution, most autocracies in the past have not been market economies. That's one of the reasons there aren't so many autocracies anymore. But China is looking at things differently. It is by a self-proclaimed people's democratic dictatorship, but it very much aspires to let the market govern a substantial percentage of the economy, not the entirety of it. So you have a social compact, you have the market mechanism, that's the S part and the M part of the word smart. What does A stand for? A stands for, and it could be a couple of things, I think. And I'm still working on this, but you're hearing the first version. I would say, let me go for now with anticipatory. And what I mean by that is something very specific, and it's an area where I think China has a substantial competitive advantage over the United States in ways that we in this country don't talk about much. But I've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years now. And that is, of all of the different advantages that one country might have over another, who has the bigger economy, who has the bigger military, who has the more powerful military, who has more innovation, who has more this and that, there's one thing that I think we can all agree that China has an advantage on with respect to the United States, has an advantage over the United States on. And that is, it has the ability to plan long-term in a way that our country simply does not. And there's a reason for that. That's because they know that the Communist Party will always be in power. It may not be Xi Jinping. It'll be Xi Jinping's successor. It'll be that successor's successor. But it is a one-party state. There is continuity. And thus there is an ability to plan on a 5, 10, 20, and 50-year time horizon that we simply don't have in this country because of this thing that we have called a messy democracy. Also, when you don't have to worry about these pesky folks called voters, you can do a lot of things that legislators and presidents that have to worry about voters can't readily do. So there is, if I can coin the phrase here, and I may be saying it for the first time publicly, but I've said it for some years, there is a dictatorship dividend versus a democracy drag when it comes to the issue of planning. We simply can't compete because of our cherished system, which none of us would trade. We simply cannot compete with a country that is thinking not about next week or tomorrow's news cycle, but about infrastructure 30 years out. And that is a disadvantage, whether we like, whether Americans are comfortable with or like or regard as moral the Chinese system of governance or not. That is a competitive advantage that China's system generates. And it is one of the reasons why I have said that China is America's most formidable overall national competitor. And this is something that's rarely talked about, but it's at the root of some of the widening gaps that we see. So the issue of anticipatory, what I mean is that the Chinese leadership can really think about things down the line in a way that we can't. Let me be brief I know I'm coming close to my time limit here. The R stands for responsive. In a system where you don't have voting, which the Chinese system doesn't in the same way that we and other democracies do, you nevertheless have to try to figure out, if you want to remain in power for a long time, how to respond to some of the basic needs and concerns of your populace when you can't assess what those concerns are via the ballot box. If you don't have that tool in your toolkit, then you need to find another way to be responsive. And a smart dictatorship, while not necessarily, in fact not electorally accountable, nevertheless seeks to be responsive, and China seeks to do that. And the T stands for technology. And I would say technology enabled, technology savvy, and I would almost say technology obsessed. This is a serious high-tech powerhouse that we're dealing with. We see that in the area of artificial intelligence and numerous other areas. China is becoming a serious competitor to the United States in the most advanced computing that's out there. And the use of technology to attain smart dictatorship, or what I sometimes refer to as smartatorship, to coin a phrase, is something that's a hallmark of what China's doing, and frankly, from its vantage, very successful. All of those are the things that I think China is, by design, trying to focus on. And by design, it is seeking to become that alternative model that works. And as it presents itself out there, countries are going to look at our model and our politics and our news cycles. They're going to look at China's model. And in Africa, Latin America, and some other parts of the world, they're going to look at those systems and judge for themselves which is best for them. But that's the end game here. Let me just say one concluding thought on the issue of smart dictatorship or smartatorship, etc. And that is, there are certainly challenges associated with this type of model, but I think the biggest one is the one that Xi Jinping has identified, the notion of corruption. The notion of corruption. In a one-party regime, you're never going to get at most of the corruption. And unless and until that fundamental issue is addressed, even as Xi Jinping himself acknowledged it's an existential issue for the party, that is always going to be constraint on performance of the Chinese model. So that's out there, and I'm sure the Chinese leadership is grappling with that. Let me just shift, and I'll just be very brief here, and hopefully we'll have good discussion in Q&A. I just want to say one thing. I was going to talk about U.S.-China relations. Let me just give you the summary version of this, and we can draw this out in Q&A. Overall, I think the immediate impact of the 19th Party Congress on U.S.-China relations or on the U.S. is relatively limited. Over time, I think we will see some impact as some of the themes and the rhetoric turn into real policies and actions. It takes a while for the ship of state to move in a way that's discernible. Over time, I think we will see some serious implications. In the immediate wake of the Congress, there's not much one could point to where I can say U.S.-China relations are different today than they were. Overall, whether the issue is North Korea, South China Sea, U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, the broader issue of Taiwan, trade, which is massively important, investment, human rights, on almost all of these issues, I see very little evidence of significant change at the 1-year mark of the Trump administration relative to the policies of the Barack Obama administration toward China. Has there been a slightly different rhetoric and type of language used? Yes. Has there been a different tonality at times? Yes. President Trump has been both hot and cold, or I should say tough and also unusually warm toward China, including in his presidential visit to China in November. But by and large, when you scrape away the rhetoric and scrape away the surface level stuff, what you see is much more continuity thus far than change on every set of issues. In fact, let me advisedly or ill-advisedly just use the toughest language I can to, in the views of some, to put it in summary form. With respect to the first year of the Trump administration's policies on China, it is the equivalent of a third Barack Obama administration. And because there really is no significant change in the substance of the relationship. Now, let me conclude by making one very important point. The one area where I think it is perhaps possible to say that the 19th Party Congress did have or is having an impact on U.S.-China relations, perhaps is in the area of the U.S. narrative right now on China. One thing I've noticed is in the fairly immediate wake of the Party Congress, which ended in October, we have started to see a slew of stories in the media and hearings on Capitol Hill and other types of expression in this country that is really focused negatively on China. And in particular, that is focused very intensively on the issue of China's, what's called China's influence operations in the United States. And this issue has been playing out in a very intense way in the media and academic circles. And it may very well be that one of the reasons for this sharp uptick in negative rhetoric in this country about China is because of that confidence, those usages with respect to the military, the language about Taiwan, and some of these things may have struck a nerve in the parts of this country and generated a higher temperature around U.S. rhetoric on China. Now, I want to make a point here that I've made many times over the years, both privately and publicly. I remember I did a talk at the museum on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington in, I think, March of 2012, just before I was out here, in fact, on the record where I talked about this theme and other talks I've done as well. But let me just say one thing. I'm concerned about the reflexive negative narrative about China in this country. I'm not concerned about it on China's behalf. I'm concerned about it because I don't think it's good for our country. And I'll tell you why. And I've said that to both Americans and to Chinese as well. The Chinese don't like it for their own reasons, and that's understandable and fine. And by the way, let me hasten to add, the negativity that we often see in the Chinese press, which is not a free media, about the United States is oftentimes, depending on what's happening in the relationship, very striking and I think very problematic. And of course, the difference is that China's media is a party-controlled media and our media is not. But that said, there's similar levels at times of negativity in the media narratives about each other. I won't talk here about the Chinese part of the equation. That's significant. There's a very unlevel playing field there, but that's a different topic. But I just want to say that I am concerned about the negativity in the U.S. narrative toward China, the reflexive negativity, for the following reasons. Number one, and I'll be brief here, but I can expand on this, and I probably will expand this to a full-fledged talk at some point. I think there's a vicious cycle effect that starts to take place. The more you reflexively view something negatively, the more they start to view you negatively, and you get into a cycle that becomes self-perpetuating and difficult to get out of, even when your national interests actually align, which in the case of the U.S. and China sometimes does happen. So you can create an accidental, or let's not say accidental, but an unfortunate sort of cyclical or vicious cycle effect by having a reflexive negative narrative. Number two, you can miss legitimate opportunities to actually work together on things that matter. And this is where I think the reflexive negativity that we sometimes see in narratives in this country about China, and let's not mince words, China is the most formidable national competitor that we have. No question about it. But a reflexive negativity can cause us to miss opportunities to work with China where we can actually achieve something together, whether it's on North Korea, whether it's on nuclear non-proliferation more generally, whether it's on climate, which obviously this administration comes at that issue very differently than the previous administration here in the U.S. But there are a host of issues where we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and deal constructively with China, even as we are clear-eyed about some of the problems in the relationship as well. We don't want to miss opportunities. The reflexive negativity can sometimes generate a reduced attention to actual facts. Facts can become less important when there's just a dominant narrative, and the politically or journalistically easy thing to do is to just say, China is the bad guy, whether or not the facts of the particular case support that conclusion. Sometimes it is the bad guy from a U.S. perspective. Sometimes it isn't, but it's portrayed to be because it's just easier to go with the narrative than it is to actually look at the issue case by case. So that can be problematic. Furthermore, and this is one that I think really comes through to me very acutely, and it came through most in the Congressional Executive Committee on China, CECC, hearing on Capitol Hill on December 13th. By being so reflexively negative on China, and yes, there are cases where we need to be cognizant that Chinese actions are inimical to our interests, but to be reflexively negative can sometimes betray a lack of confidence in our own system. It can betray a lack of confidence in our own way of life. It can convey a sense that I think is wrong, that we can't compete with China, that we're scared of competing with China in the marketplace of ideas. It conveys a sense of weakness. It conveys a sense that we are not walking with the swagger that we do as Americans because of our extraordinary Constitution and our democracy and our way of life. And that concerns me because it could embolden China and others who look at some of the statements that are made and feel that they've got us on the backs of our heels. I don't think that's good for America, and that's why I see that as problematic. There are a few other things, I'll just be very brief before concluding. The loss of moral high ground. If we start to see everything negatively and start to shut ourselves down, close ourselves off, it becomes harder for us to criticize autocracies when they do the same thing. That moral dimension to our policy has always been a hallmark. And if we start hunkering down in the way that non-democracies hunker down, I think it's not a wise thing for us to do in terms of our own interests. There's also the related issue of reciprocity. if we become negative and say we distrust exchanges with China, we distrust their motives in working with us, what are the Chinese going to say about the Fulbright program? What are the Chinese going to say about the International Visitor Leadership Program? What are the Chinese going to say about the Humphrey program? All of which are U.S. government exchanges which I used to administer when I was a diplomat. If we start saying to them, we don't trust your motives, then they may start saying to us, well, we don't trust your motives. And the kinds of exchanges that have brought so many of us together over the years and helped us understand each other better and helped Chinese understand American values better may start to dissipate and fray. To me, that would be a very sad conclusion or result or outcome of that. And finally, let me just say, the impact of the next generation of Americans, the people who are going to be the stewards of the U.S.-China relationship 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now, if we create this reflexive negativity toward China, what is that going to signal and telegraph to that generation of would-be stewards and leaders of this relationship for our nation, future elected office holders, presidents, and so on? So what I have said to Chinese and what I've said to Americans is we've got to do something about the negative narrative in America about China, not because it's good for China, but because it's good for America. And that's something I feel very strongly about. I've said that publicly and privately. And I think a big piece of that starts with, and I could say more about this, but I'll stop here, working with the heartland of this country of which Colorado is a part, Texas is a part. It's not all just about the coasts. There's a lot of contact there. I think we need to deepen heartland-to-heartland exchange to start to change the narrative to be not Pollyanna-ish, but clear-eyed and not reflexively negative. That's what I think we should try to do. Let me just conclude by saying it's been a tremendous honor to be here with all of you. I look forward to using the rest of the time to have good discussion and to respond to your questions. And thank you so much for the extraordinary welcome. I really appreciate it.
I'm a little confused when you talk about what's happening in China. How can you, I mean, I understand that the capitalist system works for quite a few people. But when you look at the past history of China, the Great Leap Forward, how many people were put out in the fields and died, when you look at the Cultural Revolution, those people are in control. And you're saying you got a benevolent leader. Well, that's great. But I would say there are thousands and thousands of people who do not agree with the human rights violations. They don't have due process. They have none of the protections we have in our Constitution. And I'm confused how you can kind of gloss over that.
Well, I mean, the topic of human rights is certainly a very valid issue to raise. I certainly don't gloss over it, and I certainly have not used, nor would I use the word benevolent. What I was trying to say is that the Chinese, for their part, are trying to perfect their system. And they're using these methodologies and these techniques to do that. As I've said repeatedly in this very talk, China is a self-proclaimed dictatorship. It is a place where people don't vote for president, legislator, or anything else in a meaningful way. I don't think I could be more clear about that in anything that I've said in the last hour. It doesn't have media freedom, as I've just said. And so, are there profound human rights issues in China? Unquestionably. There is a deplorable record of human rights violations in China. There's no question about it. When I was in the U.S. State Department, I wrote significant swaths of multiple human rights reports as part of my job. I know the issue very, very well, and I absolutely agree with you that there are very profound problems in the area of human rights, certainly from a U.S. perspective and from the perspective of many in the world. No question about it. All I was trying to do was convey to you what my perception of what the Chinese leadership is trying to do from its vantage. And a lot of that came out of the 19th Party Congress. And they're holding themselves up as a model. And this goes back to the point that I just made moments ago. We should be proud of our system, and we should be confident in the ability of our system to compete with anybody. And that's why I say we should welcome competition in the marketplace of ideas, because traditionally, we've always felt we could win that competition on the strength and the merits of our ideas, on the genius of our Constitution, on the Bill of Rights that are sacred to us. And I say this 2 days after Martin Luther King Day. So we ought to be proud to compete, and we ought to put ourselves out there to take all comers when it comes to the strength of our system. Meanwhile, the Chinese, for their part, are putting themselves out there in a way that's different, and that was the point that I was making when I talked about what's different coming out of this Party Congress. But I don't disagree with your characterizations on human rights, and they echo things that I just said over the past hour.
Hi. So I was wondering, with the recent reaction from China from the THAAD missile system and shutting other economies out, like Korea and Japan, how is the U.S. foreign policy ideals important to the social cohesion of other countries, not just ours?
Expand a little bit on the last question. How is
the U.S. Foreign policy implementation of like soft power and hard power important to the social cohesion of other states and other states and nations other than just ours?
Well, that's a pretty deep question. It's a good question. I don't know that I have a ready answer to that. I'd have to think about it. I haven't thought as much about the impact of U.S. foreign policy on social cohesion domestically within other countries. I think that this may be a slightly facetious or cynical way to respond to that, but maybe it's the closest hit I can get to the target in terms of the question that you posed. One thing that I think is improving, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but it's a documented social science data point. One thing that I think is increasing the social cohesion of countries around the world is a reaction to the current administration in the United States. And I don't mean that politically for me. What I'm saying is what we have seen objectively in data from Pew and from others is that attitudes toward the United States and responses to the specific poll question, do you have confidence in the U.S. president to do the right thing? That's a question that has been asked over decades. That's a standard question. They don't name the president. They just say, do you have confidence in the U.S. president to do the right thing? And do you have favorable views of America? Those are the two questions that have been done over a longitudinal period of time. Those numbers have dropped precipitously across the board except in a couple of countries. Russia is one of the exceptions, interestingly enough, and Israel is one of the other exceptions. And I think the only documented exception to a degree in Asia is the Philippines, whereas in China and Japan, our ally, and South Korea, our ally, and Australia, our ally, and elsewhere, we've actually seen a significant drop in favorable ratings toward the United States. People, in the sense of your question, may be, in a sense, rallying around that, for rightly or wrongly, that's their call to make. But I'll have to think more about the issue of social cohesion in other domestic contexts. But that would be one way of maybe trying to get at part of the answer.
The New York Times reporter Edwin Wong just wrapped up 10 years at the embassy in Beijing and was reflecting recently on his experience. He said China's outreach to the world can be characterized by brutality, bribery, and browbeating. And he suspected that there would be a reaction. We've seen something like that in Australia, and you mentioned the reaction reflexively, perhaps, in the U.S.
Yeah.
Will this cause China to soften, to realize its the antipathy that is generating, and will it modulate?
It's a really good question, and it's very timely. And let me say a couple of words about that. We've been seeing a lot in the papers in this country recently about the issue of what has been termed influence operations. There's another phrase for that. It's called public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is, by definition, this is just the dictionary definition, and I used to work deeply on public diplomacy when I was a U.S. State Department Foreign Service officer and public servant. Public diplomacy is the effort to understand, inform, and influence foreign public opinion in support of your own country's foreign policy goals. That is the definition of public diplomacy. We, in the United States, have a pretty robust public diplomacy program all around the world. China has an increasingly robust public diplomacy program all around the world, and particularly in this country. There is absolutely no question that China is seeking to influence discourse in this country. There's absolutely no question that they're doing that. There is absolutely no question that we are doing the same thing in China. There's no question that we're doing the same thing everywhere we have an embassy and consulate, and that every powerful nation is, without exception, doing the same thing wherever they're operating. All countries seek to influence through hopefully, through lawful means, discourse in the countries that they're dealing with, to put the discourse on terms that are more favorable to them. That is the very definition of public diplomacy. We do it, the Chinese do it, and let me say another thing about the Chinese. The Chinese, and I've been working on China professionally for over 25 years, and I've been dealing with China since the mid-1980s, and I've watched the Chinese public diplomacy efforts evolve. They started at a very, very rudimentary level that was very ham-fisted, very ineffectual, almost comical, and I don't mean that really disrespectfully, but so ineffective and clumsy as to almost be laughable. It wasn't something they were accustomed to. Now, one thing the Chinese do very well is they learn. They learn very quickly. That's one of the reasons it's driven their extraordinary growth in recent decades. And they've learned from us probably more than anyone. They've learned from others as well. And over the years, the Chinese have become vastly more sophisticated in public diplomacy and the effort, which public diplomacy is, to influence foreign public opinion in support of foreign policy objectives. China's doing that now in the United States. The point that I would make about it is, let me just make one point, and then I want to quote something to you from the December 13th Congressional Executive Committee on China hearing that touched exactly on this issue. It's a very powerful point. But let me just make the point. China is absolutely trying to influence our discourse, full stop, no question. Second sentence, they're getting very good at it, full stop. Third, as far as I know, everything they're doing is lawful. By the way, unlike some of the things that we've seen in terms of 2016, where there was unlawful, illegal activity engaged in. What the Chinese are doing is, within the constraints of U.S. law, they're seeking to influence our discourse. They're getting pretty good at it. Now, there are two responses to that. Either we take note of it, which we should do, and use the power of our example to win the contest of ideas, which has always been a fundamental American value, or we start making new laws and, heck, maybe even amending the Constitution to start restricting some of these activities in ways that we complain about when others do it to us. So I think we need to think very, very hard about what's happening here and what the optimal U.S. response to it is. And I would argue the optimal U.S. response to efforts to influence our discourse is to be the best example that we can possibly be as a nation among nations and to hold out the beacon of light that we've always sought to hold out as an exemplar, flawed exemplar maybe, the shining city on the hill of President Reagan, and so on. Because I think hunkering down, it's not that it shuts out others, it's that it fundamentally hurts us more than it hurts others. Now I want to read one thing. I didn't have time to get to it in my prepared remarks, but let me just mention this. And bear with me because it's right on the topic of influence. And let me just also say to your question, so I made those comments, but let me address your question. Is China cognizant of the reaction that's being generated to their efforts? Yes. Is that going to stop them from doing what they do? Probably not. Do Chinese reactions to our efforts to influence Chinese elites stop us? No. And so it's a contestation of ideas, and our laws allow that. China, frankly, is a much more restrictive environment in certain regards than ours is. We're very open. We're all proud of that openness. We have to be aware of what's happening, but I think we have to be level-headed about it as well. Let me segue to the point I want to make. On December 13th, there was a hearing on Capitol Hill. It was the Congressional Executive Commission on China, CECC, December 13th. You can look up the 2-hour video. It was chaired by Senator Marco Rubio. The title of the hearing was The Long Arm of Authoritarianism, basically something like China's influence efforts in the United States, something like that. Or China's long arm exporting authoritarianism with Chinese characteristics. That was the title. Now, Senator Rubio chaired the hearing. He quoted from a National Endowment of Democracy report called Sharp Power, and he quoted these words he said out loud in the hearing, and I want to say them to you. I hand wrote these on the back of a piece of paper, on the back of my handwritten speaking notes. Here's what Senator Rubio said, quoting from the report. He said, quote, Beijing's strategy, this is about China's influence efforts, Beijing's strategy clearly targets Latin American elites, topic was on Latin America, prominent regional leaders from multiple fields, including politicians, academics, journalists, former diplomats, current government officials, and students, among others, and they are subtly being enticed by the Chinese government through personal interaction with the ultimate purpose of gaining support for China. As a result, many of these renowned and influential people have already become ambassadors of the Chinese cause. Full stop. That's a direct quote from Rubio citing the report. Let me read the quote again with a little bit different language that I'm making up. I'm now adding my words. The U.S. strategy clearly targets, let's say, Chinese elites, prominent regional leaders from multiple fields, including politicians, academics, journalists, former diplomats, current government officials, and students, among others, and subtly entices them to see the U.S. government, enticed by the U.S. government through personal interaction with the ultimate purpose of gaining their support for the United States. As a result, many of these renowned and influential people have already become ambassadors of the U.S. cause. That statement would be an exactly accurate characterization of U.S. public diplomacy. But when China does it, and I ran U.S. public diplomacy programs for years in my career, and no one would disagree. In fact, the senator, to his credit, and I respect him, came back and said, well, later he said, come to think of it, that's a pretty good definition of what we ourselves do. He acknowledged that later. But the fact is that is a precise definition of U.S. public diplomacy. That is the dictionary mission statement of our efforts. There's nothing wrong with it. And if we don't think there's anything wrong when we do it, then we have to acknowledge as a matter of fairness that others are going to do it too, even in the service of regime types that we don't like too much here in this country. So that's the world we live in, and I just think we have to be level-headed before we start a domino effect that shuts down very valuable exchanges between our countries. Let's win the contest of ideas by engaging, not by hunkering down.
Let's move to an internal Chinese area of interest. The Chinese, you mentioned the social compact. The Chinese social services are delivered through a system called Hangku, where you're born and you can have those only regionally. However, with the millions of internal migrants in China who have moved to the coastal areas, can't bring their children with them because they're not eligible for health care. They can't bring them with them, they can't their family because they're not eligible for the Chinese Communist Party's education. So do you see a concern with all of these disenfranchised millions of Chinese migrants?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And I mean, the number of profound public policy challenges that the Chinese leadership faces is very substantial. The issue of internal displacement, internal migrants, migrant labor, folks coming from rural areas to small towns and cities to try to capitalize on industrialization, urbanization, with a lot of people, just as you rightly described, based on the hukou system that you mentioned, slipping through the cracks, not being legally, if you will, registered in city A or city B. That means that their kids can't go to school. That means they can't go to a doctor in a normal way. That is definitely one of the most profound public policy challenges that the Chinese face. And there's not, within the context of the Chinese system, there's not an easy answer to it because of the bigger, deeper social and economic currents that are playing out, the overall trend toward urbanization. When I first started traveling to China in the 1980s, China was probably at that time 2/3 an agricultural and rural country, 1/3 urban. Today I think it's, I should know the exact number, but maybe 60+% urban, maybe 2/3 urban by some definitions. It's essentially flip-flop. So there's been an inexorable trend. Meanwhile, there's not enough school seats to go around, strains on public services. Bottom line is, yes, that's a profound challenge, and it's a challenge that I think the Chinese leadership looks at very acutely through the prism of the issue of social stability. Because, as I said before, and as President Xi, to his credit, has said very openly, China is thinking in terms of what are the existential threats to the party. Again, first principle of Chinese governance, permanent maintenance of the monopoly of power of the Chinese Communist Party. Whatever is a threat to that monopoly on power, and again, what I'm saying is now consistent with the party's own explicit party constitution. So I'm simply articulating China's policy. Whatever is inimical or a threat to that overriding interest, that first principle, is an existential threat. I think a lot of Chinese leaders look at the internal displacement as something that could generate significant levels of social instability, and I think that they seek to address it as best they can as part of China's overall transformation toward the ranks of a middle-class country. But I don't underestimate how difficult that task is.
You mentioned the rise in the wealthy number of Chinese and also the rise in the middle class. Do you view them as a potential existential threat as you were defining it?
It's a really good question. And, let me just say that I think historically, many American China scholars, including myself, back in the 80s and 90s, tended to buy into the basic narrative that as a country gets richer, let's be more specific, as China gets richer, as more people have middle-class wealth and sensibilities and have property that they want to protect in courts of law and so forth and so on, contracts, that inexorably leads toward, and of necessity, it inexorably leads toward democracy. That has not turned out to be the case in China over the last 30-plus years. And people that had thought that would happen have been, at least thus far, proven wrong. And that includes me, because I would have thought in the 1980s that as that happened, you'd see a different type of governance in China by this time. That hasn't proved to pan out. I think it's a question mark. I'm beginning to join that school of thought in this country, and there is a divided opinion on this. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer because we're speculating about the future and we don't yet know definitively what the future holds, and we can't know. But there are more and more people who I think are beginning to believe that the Chinese regime as it looks and as it is right now, as a constitutional dictatorship, people's democratic dictatorship, may very well have substantial lasting power, substantial staying power, and may very, very well be around for a long, long time to come, notwithstanding the explosion of wealth across the country. China has more billionaires than all of Europe combined. It'll overtake us in terms of number of billionaires pretty soon. And it probably, at some point before too long, may end up having more billionaires than the entire rest of the world combined. We're not far from that. And leave the billionaires out of it, just the middle class, people that have homes and cars and save for college and send their kids often to the U.S. To study here, and have middle class needs and attributes and financial goals. It's not, I have to say, it's not self-evident to me today that the mere fact that there may be now hundreds of millions of what we might call middle class Chinese, that that's going to result in a transformation of the system anytime soon. I think it's an open question. And this is why I come back to what I think is the big question. The big question for China is, can China manage a transition from, to put it in very broad terms, 20th century people's democratic dictatorship, otherwise known as dictatorship, to 21st century smart dictatorship. And if they can, and if they can adhere to the social compact, and if they can give people enough of what they want, if they can be responsive enough, to go back to the word I used, the R in smart, if they can be tech savvy enough, as they seem to be able to use technology for their particular purposes and governance style, and they've proved pretty adept at doing that thus far, then I think that there could be considerable staying power to this regime type. So I think it's an open question, and it strikes right to the heart of a very central, fundamental philosophical question about China's future. One more question. And I'll stick around afterwards for any folks that may want to talk privately. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a bit about the relationship between China and North Korea, and whether you think China has the ability or the willingness to affect the North Korea weapons program?
That's a great question, and we've done some convening on this recently. And let me tell you what I think about this. The short answer, and I want to expand just for a minute or so afterwards, in a realistic sense, I don't think China has either the will or the capability or the correct combination of the two to shut down North Korea and to terminate this problem. Now notice what I said. I didn't say it doesn't have the capability. I said it either doesn't have the capability and or will or combination of both, whatever that combination is. A lot of it is about will, and a lot of it is about how they view their own neighborhood. And a lot of it is about what China thinks could happen if you bring instability to a regime that possesses the ability to deliver at least a rudimentary nuclear weapon somewhere. And China neighbors North Korea. So China looks at North Korea through a prism that is very different than we do, from a greater distance. The United States and China nominally share the same goal. And I think we actually do, in fact, share the same goal, stated goal. Theoretically, at this point, we both share the goal that we want to see a non-nuclear Korean peninsula. and a nuclear weapons-free Korean Peninsula. And now, I want to share my observation about this based on some discussions with significant folks on both sides, and having worked the issue some professionally and also in a track two diplomacy context where we're convening people off the record. I think that both the United States and China are fundamentally wrong about North Korea, but for exactly the opposite reasons. I think that the U.S., as a matter of current policy, and this goes back through to Obama, Bush, this is not just Trump, this has been consistent U.S. policy going back several presidencies. We are wrong when we think that there is some amount of coercion that can be brought to bear on North Korea that could get North Korea to stop doing this. Because I personally believe that North Korea will pursue these weapons until the last North Korean is dead. I don't think there's any question about it. And basically, to use my words, but to overlay them onto North Korean sentiment, and to use kind of a Texas metaphor, it was recently at the Alamo, North Korea's attitude is, you want to stop us? Come stop us. And if you don't, then we're just going to keep marching right down this path. And thus far, in the judgments of U.S. presidents of both parties going back 2 or 3, we haven't judged that it has been in our best interest to take that challenge, the sort of come and take it challenge. China looks at North Korea and believes there is some amount of diplomacy that can be brought to bear on North Korea that could get North Korea to stop. And I think China is dead wrong in that assessment. Just as wrong as we are in the opposite assessment. Now, what does that mean? If you accept my premise that neither coercion nor diplomacy will solve this problem because the North Koreans are single-mindedly focused on achieving this objective at all costs, then what it means is the only way that anyone could stop North Korea would be if they went to war to stop them. Now, my personal opinion is that, this is just my opinion. I'm a private citizen. I don't work for the government. I don't have any inside information. My personal opinion as a private citizen is we're not going to fight that war. Not any president, not this president, not any president. And I think the reason for that is because every president of all parties, this is not a partisan issue, in my judgment, my assessment has judged that that solution would be worse than the problem. That's why it doesn't happen. That's why it hasn't happened yet. And so I conclude with this thought, and this is a fairly on the, and I'm not the world's greatest North Korea expert, I don't contend to be, but this is on sort of the front edge of the discussion about this, and I've been talking about this for about a year. I think the North Korea issue is over. It's actually over. There is no viable way to prevent North Korea from becoming a nuclear weapons state with intercontinental capability. It's going to happen. It's a very bad scenario from a U.S. perspective and from a world perspective. It's a bad scenario from a Chinese perspective. It's a bad scenario from a South Korean perspective, Japan perspective, and everyone in the world. And I just don't think I don't think any other scenario is going to play out. So I think both the United States and China and others have failed in attaining our stated objective. And I think the real discussion now, sadly, in my personal opinion, I'd love to be wrong about it, but I don't think I am. The real discussion right now, I think, and now and going forward, is how does the world manage a nuclear weapons state in North Korea? It's a sad thing to have to say, but I think that's where the discussion really is. I don't think, and let me just share, my personal sense from talking to private folks in China and in the United States is, I think this assessment that I'm offering here in my personal capacity is becoming a more commonplace assessment than it was even 6 months ago. I think, in short, sadly for America and for the world, the train left a long, long time ago. And this will end up happening on President Trump's watch, but it's not any one individual's fault. It's a failure over decades of every single player involved in this process, including us, including China, and including everyone else that tried to deal with this. So it's not a good news story from my perspective, unfortunately, but that's my assessment of it. And with that, listen, thanks so much, y'all. Really appreciate it. Thank you.